It was the late 19th century when Vietnam, along with its neighbors Laos and Cambodia, fell under the control of the French. Known as French Indochina, Vietnam became a valuable part of France's colonial empire. The French were drawn by its rich natural resources, rubber, rice, and minerals, and they quickly imposed their rule over the Vietnamese people. But this occupation was never peaceful. For decades, the Vietnamese people lived under harsh colonial policies. The French exploited the land and the people, taking wealth and offering little in return. The majority of the population lived in poverty, while a small elite benefited from French collaboration. It was a system designed to suppress and control. Resistance movements sparked early, even before the 20th century, but one man would soon rise to become the symbol of Vietnam's struggle for freedom: Ho Chi Minh. Born in Nguyen Cong in 1890, Ho Chi Minh was a revolutionary who spent his early years traveling the world, absorbing the ideas of nationalism and communism. By the 1920s, he had returned to Southeast Asia, determined to free Vietnam from colonial rule. The pivotal moment came during World War II. As France was weakened by the German occupation, Japan took control of Vietnam, but it was a brutal and short-lived occupation. In 1945, as World War II ended and Japan withdrew, Ho Chi Minh seized the opportunity to declare Vietnam's independence. On September 2nd, 1945, in Hanoi's Ba Dinh Square, he proclaimed the birth of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, quoting the American Declaration of Independence: "All men are created equal." But Vietnam's fate was far from secure. The French, determined to regain control of their colony, refused to recognize Vietnam's independence. What followed was the First Indochina War, a bloody conflict that would last from 1946 to 1954. Ho Chi Minh's forces, known as the Viet Minh, waged a guerrilla war against the French. They fought in the jungles, in the villages, and wherever they could. For the Vietnamese, it was a war for survival, for freedom from decades of colonial oppression. The French, however, were not ready for the kind of war the Viet Minh fought. The decisive moment came in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, a remote valley in northern Vietnam. The Viet Minh, through sheer determination and tactical brilliance, defeated the French forces in a siege that shocked the world. It was a humbling blow to France's imperial ambitions. With the fall of Dien Bien Phu, the French had no choice but to negotiate. At the Geneva Conference in 1954, a deal was struck. Vietnam would be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel. The north would be controlled by Ho Chi Minh and the communist-led Viet Minh, while the south would be under a non-communist regime led by Emperor Bao Dai, who was later replaced by the American-backed leader Ngo Dinh Diem. This division was never meant to be permanent. A general election was scheduled for 1956 to reunify the country under a single government, but that election never happened. The seeds of future conflict had already been sown. Vietnam was now split in two: North Vietnam, with a communist government in Hanoi, and South Vietnam, led by an anti-communist regime in Saigon. The stage was set for a new kind of war, one that would soon draw in the world's superpowers. What had begun as a fight against colonialism was about to escalate into a Cold War battlefield, with the United States and the Soviet Union backing opposite sides. The Vietnam War, as we know it today, was about to begin. As the ink dried on the Geneva Accords in 1954, Vietnam stood divided, teetering on the edge of an uncertain future. The agreement called for a temporary split at the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh's communist government would control the north, and the south would be led by the French-backed Emperor Bao Dai, soon replaced by a new and controversial figure, Ngo Dinh Diem. This division, however, was meant to be short-lived. The Accords called for nationwide elections in 1956, a vote that was supposed to reunite the country under a single government. But that vote would never happen. For both the North and South, the years following the division were a delicate dance of power, ideology, and outside influence. In the north, Ho Chi Minh set to work consolidating power, rebuilding the war-ravaged land, and cementing his vision of a unified communist Vietnam. Ho had the support of many. His Viet Minh forces were seen as national heroes after their victory against the French. His government was built on promises of land reform, equality, and freedom from foreign domination. But beneath the surface, his regime was harsh, particularly toward those who were seen as enemies of the state. Thousands of landlords and dissidents were purged in brutal campaigns to secure control. Meanwhile, in the south, things were more complicated. Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunch anti-communist and nationalist, took power with the backing of the United States. Diem was an educated man, fiercely independent, and deeply Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist country. He had lived in exile during the French occupation and returned to Vietnam with high hopes for leading the New South, but his leadership soon became controversial. Diem rejected the idea of the 1956 reunification elections, fearing correctly that Ho Chi Minh would win by a landslide. The North had broad support across the country, especially in rural areas where the promise of land redistribution resonated with peasants. Diem's refusal to hold the elections only deepened the divide between North and South, and it marked the beginning of what would become a long and bloody struggle. For Diem, the challenges were immense. His government, though supported by the U.S., was weak and corrupt. He filled key positions with family members and trusted loyalists, alienating many in the South. His authoritarian policies, including harsh crackdowns on political opponents and communist sympathizers, only fueled resentment. The South was already home to a growing communist insurgency, groups that would later come to be known as the Viet Cong. These guerrilla fighters, with the backing of Ho Chi Minh's North, began their campaign of resistance against Diem's government. In the countryside, Diem's policies further alienated the population. His land reforms, meant to redistribute land to the poor, largely failed, and his favoritism toward Catholics led to tensions with the majority Buddhist population. Many rural Vietnamese, struggling to survive, found themselves turning toward the Viet Cong, who promised to fight for their interests. As the situation in the South deteriorated, North Vietnam, under Ho Chi Minh and his top military leader, General Vo Nguyen Giap, saw an opportunity. They began quietly sending support, money, weapons, and military advisors to the Viet Cong. Their goal was to destabilize Diem's regime and eventually reunite Vietnam under communist rule. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, a secret network of jungle paths and tunnels stretching from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia into South Vietnam, became a crucial supply route for this insurgency. It was a lifeline for the Viet Cong fighters who now waged a guerrilla war against Diem's government. At this point, the Cold War was in full swing, and Vietnam had become a key battleground in the global struggle between communism and democracy. The United States, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, saw Vietnam as part of the broader fight to contain communism, subscribing to the domino theory, the belief that if one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, the rest would follow. America could not afford to let South Vietnam collapse, and so began their involvement, initially with economic aid and military advisors to support Diem's government. But it wasn't just the Americans who saw Vietnam as strategically important. The Soviet Union and China, eager to expand the communist bloc, provided significant aid to North Vietnam. Vietnam was now a pawn in a much larger game, a Cold War chess match between the world's superpowers. In the early 1960s, under the presidency of John F. Kennedy, U.S. involvement in Vietnam increased significantly. Though Kennedy was cautious about committing ground troops, he escalated the number of American military advisors and sent in more equipment and training to bolster the South Vietnamese army. The goal was to strengthen Diem's government and prevent the communist insurgency from gaining further ground. But despite American efforts, the Viet Cong continued to grow in strength. In 1963, South Vietnam was unraveling. Diem's leadership had become increasingly authoritarian, and his government was losing the support of its people. Buddhist monks, outraged by Diem's religious favoritism, began staging protests, some resorting to self-immolation in public acts of defiance. The world watched in horror as images of burning monks spread across international media, symbolizing the deepening crisis in South Vietnam. The situation reached a tipping point in November of 1963. With tacit support from the U.S., a group of South Vietnamese generals staged a coup. Diem and his brother were captured and assassinated, marking the end of his controversial rule. But the fall of Diem did not stabilize the country. Instead, it plunged South Vietnam into political chaos, with one military junta after another vying for power. The Viet Cong, meanwhile, seized on the instability to increase their attacks, further weakening the government. By the end of 1963, the conflict in Vietnam had spiraled out of control. What had started as a struggle for independence from colonial rule had now become a full-blown civil war, with the U.S. and its allies on one side and the communist forces of North Vietnam and the Viet Cong on the other. The stage was set for the next chapter of the conflict, a chapter that would see the full military might of the United States unleashed in the jungles of Vietnam. The Vietnam War, as the world would soon know it, was about to escalate dramatically. As the political chaos in South Vietnam deepened, a dramatic escalation in the Vietnam War loomed on the horizon. It was the summer of 1964 when a pivotal event would change everything: the Gulf of Tonkin incident. On August 2nd, the USS Maddox, a U.S. destroyer on patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin, was reportedly attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Just 2 days later, a second alleged attack was reported, though details were murky and later revealed to be exaggerated. Seizing the moment, President Lyndon B. Johnson addressed the nation, framing the incidents as unprovoked aggression and calling for a response. The result was the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, passed overwhelmingly by Congress on August 7th. This resolution granted Johnson broad authority to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war, marking a significant turning point in U.S. involvement. With newfound power, Johnson launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a relentless bombing campaign aimed at crippling North Vietnam's infrastructure and supply lines. The skies darkened with American bombers as they unleashed destruction on factories and military targets, all in the hope of deterring the North's support for the Viet Cong. In March 1965, Johnson made a fateful decision to commit ground troops to Vietnam, with the first combat soldiers landing in Da Nang. The war had shifted from advisory support to full-scale military engagement, with troop levels peaking at over 500,000 by 1969. But the challenges were immense. The Viet Cong employed guerrilla tactics, blending into the civilian population and utilizing the dense jungles to launch surprise attacks. Traditional military strategies struggled against this elusive enemy, complicating efforts to achieve victory. As the conflict raged on, images of the war's brutality flooded the American media, igniting public dissent. Protests erupted nationwide, questioning the purpose and morality of the war. What had begun as a mission to contain communism was now a deeply divisive issue, testing the nation's resolve and revealing fractures within its society. The Vietnam War was entering its most turbulent phase, a battle not only for the hearts of the Vietnamese, but also for the conscience of America itself. With no end in sight, the struggle would leave lasting scars on both nations, shaping their futures for decades to come. As the Vietnam War escalated, the experiences of American soldiers became central to its narrative. Deployed in a foreign land, they faced relentless combat in dense jungles and rice paddies, struggling against the Viet Cong's guerrilla tactics. The psychological toll of warfare weighed heavily on many, leaving them to grapple with fear and uncertainty amid the chaos. Back home, the media shaped public perception by broadcasting graphic images and stories of the war's brutality. Reports of civilian casualties and wounded soldiers eroded support for the conflict, fueling a growing anti-war sentiment across the nation. For the Vietnamese people, the war's impact was catastrophic. Bombed villages and the widespread use of chemical herbicides like Agent Orange led to devastating health consequences and displacement. As discontent grew, protests erupted nationwide, with activists and students questioning the war's morality. The Tet Offensive in January 1968 became a critical turning point. Although a military setback for North Vietnam, it shocked the American public and shattered the illusion of imminent victory, leading to widespread disillusionment with the conflict. The Vietnam War had transformed into a struggle for the soul of a nation, leaving deep scars on both the soldiers who fought and the society they returned to. As the Vietnam War dragged on, the toll on American soldiers and Vietnamese civilians intensified, prompting a push for peace. In January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, establishing a framework for the withdrawal of U.S. troops and a ceasefire between North and South Vietnam. Despite this agreement, the situation remained precarious, and as American forces pulled out, the North Vietnamese launched a sustained offensive. On April 30th, 1975, the fall of Saigon marked the war's tragic conclusion. In a chaotic evacuation, U.S. diplomats and citizens were airlifted as North Vietnamese tanks rolled into the city, leading to the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. For the Vietnamese people, the aftermath was devastating. Years of conflict had left the country in ruins, with many displaced and facing dire economic hardships. In the United States, the war sparked profound political and social changes. Veterans returned to a divided nation, often encountering hostility and neglect, which led to the rise of movements advocating for their rights. The Vietnam War eroded public trust in the government and reshaped American foreign policy, leaving lasting lessons about military intervention and the importance of understanding local contexts. The scars of the Vietnam War would linger long after the last troops departed, forever altering the landscape of both Vietnam and the United States, and reminding both nations of the high cost of conflict. The end of the Vietnam War came swiftly in early 1975 as North Vietnamese forces launched a decisive offensive against the South. Capitalizing on a weakened South Vietnamese military, the North rapidly advanced, capturing major cities and leaving chaos in their wake. The fall of Da Nang in March signaled the beginning of the end, as panic spread throughout Saigon. On April 30th, 1975, the city fell. North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the streets, marking a tragic climax to the conflict. In a desperate evacuation effort, U.S. personnel and South Vietnamese allies scrambled for safety at the U.S. Embassy, leading to harrowing scenes of helicopters lifting people from rooftops. Many were left behind, fearing for their lives and the fate of their families. With the fall of Saigon, Vietnam was reunified under communist rule, but the aftermath was fraught with challenges. The country faced immense difficulties in rebuilding from years of devastation, grappling with economic hardships and social upheaval. In the United States, the war's conclusion left deep scars on the national psyche, prompting a reevaluation of foreign policy and a lingering sense of disillusionment. The legacy of the Vietnam War would shape future military engagements and influence U.S.-Vietnam relations for decades. Though the conflict had ended, its impact would resonate for generations, serving as a haunting reminder of the complexities of war and the profound human cost involved. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history and detailed explanations of the world's most important events.